When I first watched The Last Duel, 2021, I remember feeling as though I had stepped not just into another historical epic, but into a quiet reckoning with truth itself, how it bends, fractures, and multiplies under power, pride, and pain. It's strange how a film about knights, honor, and medieval France can feel so disturbingly modern. My literature-loving friends, I want to take you with me into this atmosphere of cold castles and harsher silences, where a duel isn't simply a test of swordsmanship. It's a desperate attempt by men to control a story that was never theirs to begin with. There's something almost Shakespearean about the way the movie unfolds. The echo of tragedies where human ego masquerades as justice, where every gesture becomes a weapon, and where silence carries the weight of entire lives. It begins like any grand historical retelling, armor clanging, banners waving, the promise of spectacle. But beneath that pageantry lies something raw, unsettling, and eerily familiar to our own time. I recall the first impression. The grim mist over the battlefield, men charging in heavy armor, and a clang of metal that feels less like heroism and more like futility. The visuals immediately ground you in brutality, not romance. And within this rough world, Ridley Scott weaves a tale of Jean Carouge's, Jacques Legree, and Marguerite de Carouge's. A triangle not of love, but of loyalty, power, and accusation. You feel early on that what's at stake isn't land or inheritance. It's dignity in a time when dignity belonged only to men. The film's opening makes you think you're about to watch another story of knights settling disputes and blood, but as the chapters unfold, you realize it's something more layered, almost literary in its structure. It's a story told 3 times, from 3 perspectives, and each retelling peels away another layer of deceit until the only thing left standing is pain itself. It's Rashomon by way of medieval France, but with a moral core that doesn't just question memory. It interrogates male vanity and institutional cruelty. I remember sitting there thinking how elegant the deception is. You're first drawn to the surface, the duel, the code of honor, the glinting steel. But soon, the rhythm slows, and Ridley Scott invites you to witness not action but interpretation. Every glance between the characters becomes suspect. Every smile hides an unspoken imbalance. What I love most is how the film gives you no safe ground. It refuses to tell you who to trust, who's lying, or even what truth means when filtered through 3 different egos. And that's what makes the storytelling so potent. It mirrors our own fragmented modern narratives, where truth is negotiated, edited, and weaponized. The movie isn't simply a medieval story. It's a mirror held up to every era where power decides what's real. I think about Marguerite's silence, the space between her words, the eyes that never quite meet the men around her. In a world ruled by male pride, her story becomes the most dangerous truth of all. And the brilliance lies in how Ridley Scott builds tension not through battles, but through words, testimonies, and the unbearable stillness of injustice. You see these men wrapped in layers of armor, yet so fragile beneath it, desperate to preserve their sense of righteousness. Watching it, I felt anger build quietly, not the kind that bursts, but the kind that simmers, that recognizes how history has often erased the voices of women and called it chivalry. Every frame feels haunted by that silence. The long corridors, the cold churches, the echoing halls where decisions about women are made by men who claim divine authority. It's both haunting and painfully real. And then there's the duel itself, the so-called spectacle that history remembers. The build-up to that fight carries an emotional weight that's hard to describe. It's as if the entire feudal world is watching 2 men fight not for justice, but for their egos, while the woman whose truth is being defended watches from the margins, her life dependent on which man dies first. The choreography of that scene, mud, blood, breath, is so visceral that it almost erases the myth of knighthood. By the time the swords clash, you're no longer cheering for anyone. You're just desperate for it to stop. It's there in that chaos that the film delivers its sharpest irony, that the truth, when forced to prove itself through violence, always loses something essential. I remember leaving the film with the image of Marguerite burned into my mind, not as a victim, but as the only character who truly evolves. Her strength doesn't come from revenge or defiance, but from survival in a world that would rather erase her than believe her. The men, meanwhile, collapse under the weight of their delusions. Carouge's believing in his divine right, Legree in his charm, and the entire society in its absurd rituals of proof. And perhaps that's the heart of what Ridley Scott was saying. That progress in any age depends on whose story we finally choose to hear. When the credits rolled, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd witnessed something more than a film. It felt like a confession from history itself. There's an irony in how modern the dialogue feels, even when wrapped in medieval costumes. You sense that behind the armor and titles, these people are no different from those today who use systems, institutions, or fame to silence others. The film never lectures. It just shows, and that's its genius. It trusts you to feel the discomfort, to question your instincts, to wonder why certain scenes seem to shift in meaning depending on who tells them. That's why this movie lingers. It doesn't resolve. It unsettles. It asks you to look at your own biases, how easily you believe a charming man, how quickly you doubt a quiet woman, how naturally you assume that strength equals truth. I think that's why I keep revisiting it, because every time, it reminds me how fragile our ideas of justice really are. So as we begin this exploration together, I want you to watch not just the story on the screen, but the one inside yourself, the way you react, the moments you feel certain, the times you hesitate. That's what makes The Last Duel such a powerful experience. It's not about who wins or loses. It's about how the truth survives, or doesn't, in the noise of pride and power. And maybe, in the end, that's why the duel was always destined to be the last one. Not because men became wiser, but because history finally began to listen. The story begins in fragments, the kind that force you to assemble meaning from different corners of the same house. The first half of the film takes us through Jean de Carouge's eyes, his pride, his pain, and his desperate belief that honor can be restored through valor. Ridley Scott opens with scenes of feudal France drenched in muted grays and metallic light, setting a tone that feels both historical and psychological. You see Jean as a soldier, a man bred for combat, trudging through mud and betrayal, trying to carve a legacy in a world where everything is inherited, titles, land, and prejudice alike. The first part doesn't rush to dramatize events. It lingers on the frustration of a man who fights wars for others and receives nothing but debt in return. You can almost smell the damp earth of Normandy, the chill of mornings that begin with the clatter of armor and end with the empty silence of disappointment. Jean's version of the story feels straightforward at first, even noble. He's a loyal knight, unappreciated by his superiors, wronged by his friend Jacques Legree, and neglected by fate. In his eyes, he's the embodiment of justice, a man whose only fault is honesty. But the beauty of this first act lies in how Ridley Scott subtly undermines that perception. Every act of righteousness feels slightly off, every complaint tinged with self-pity. You start to notice that Jean's sense of honor is inseparable from his pride. He loves deeply but possessively, fights bravely but with vanity, and speaks of God while seething with resentment. His friendship with Legree, portrayed initially as brotherly camaraderie, gradually reveals cracks. First a friendly rivalry over battle credit, then tension over land inheritance, and finally pure contempt. The movie captures these shifts not with melodrama, but through glances and silences. The way Jean's eyes harden as shared laugh between his wife and his rival, or the way Legree's charm begins to look like mockery through Jean's gaze. What strikes me about this first half is its restraint. The film doesn't glorify battles or simplify conflict into good and evil. It shows war as an extension of ego, faith as a shield for pride, and justice as something men invoke when they've lost everything else. Every frame in Jean's retelling feels weighted with grievance. His wife, Marguerite, is shown as dutiful and respectful, a symbol of purity and obedience. His rivals are schemers. His life is a sequence of humiliations inflicted by others. But you start to feel that the tragedy isn't in what happens to him. It's in how he sees it. He believed himself to be the victim of a corrupt world, but his vision is too narrow to recognize his own role in it. This makes his version of the story less reliable the longer it continues. He's convinced that truth is a sword, something to be brandished and defended, rather than a mirror that demands self-reflection. One of my favorite aspects of this first part is the way Scott builds tension between perception and reality. When Jean marries Marguerite, it feels like a triumph, a hard-working knight finally gaining a noble alliance. But even in his own version, you sense that love isn't what drives him. It's ambition. Marguerite comes with land, influence, and legitimacy, things Jean craves more than intimacy. Their marriage ceremony feels ceremonial in every sense, an exchange of property disguised as devotion. And yet, for all his flaws, you can't entirely dismiss Gene. There's a strange dignity in his struggle. He's a man out of time, fighting for fairness in a world where fairness doesn't exist. But his faith in the system, in the church, and in the king's justice becomes his downfall. He doesn't realize that these institutions value appearances more than truth. So when Marguerite's accusation later threatens that structure, Gene's instinct isn't empathy. It's to reclaim control, to restore his public image as the wronged husband. The duel becomes his last resort, not for justice, but for validation. The dynamic between Gene and Legree is one of the most fascinating rivalries I've seen in recent historical cinema. Their friendship feels real, shaped by shared battles and mutual respect. But beneath it lies jealousy. Gene envies Legree's intellect and charm, while Legree resents Gene's self-righteousness. The film frames their interactions like chess moves, polite exchanges masking strategic hostility. The dinner scenes, the gatherings, the subtle smiles, everything feels like a power play. Scott stages these moments with incredible patience, allowing you to notice the tiny shifts in social standing that mean everything in feudal society. A delayed bow, an unfinished toast, a withheld favor. Each gesture becomes political, and all of it accumulates until Gene, stripped of respect and resources, feels cornered enough to demand divine judgment through the duel. The pacing of this first half feels deliberately heavy. It mirrors Gene's personality, earnest, blunt, and weary. The editing gives you time to breathe the same air as these characters, to feel the suffocation of their rigid world. There's almost no glamour to it. The castles look cold and unforgiving, the costumes weighty, the meals unappetizing. Even moments of intimacy are awkward, almost mechanical. You understand that for these people, life is about duty, not desire. That's what makes the coming shift in perspective so powerful. By anchoring the first act so firmly in Gene's worldview, Ridley Scott prepares you for the shock of how different the same moments will appear later. The audience begins by sympathizing with him, but the longer his story unfolds, the more uneasy that sympathy becomes. There's one moment early on that always stays with me. Gene returning from war to find that his land rights have been reassigned to Legree. He storms into court, demanding justice, and receives nothing but bureaucratic coldness. The humiliation is palpable. Yet, when you step back, you realize how blind he is to the world around him. He believes the system is rigged only when it turns against him, not when it exploits others. That, to me, is where the film begins to whisper its critique. Not a single man's misfortune, but of an entire moral order that confuses hierarchy with righteousness. The duel itself hasn't yet happened, but you can already sense its inevitability. Every wound to Gene's pride becomes another brick in the wall of his obsession. By the time Marguerite's accusation enters the picture, his decision to fight to the death feels less like courage and more like the final act of man unable to face his own irrelevance. Watching this first half feels like studying the anatomy of pride. You see how it disguises itself as honor, how it grows stronger when unacknowledged, and how it can make even suffering look noble. Gene's story, in his own words, is a tragedy of betrayal, but from a wider lens, it's the tragedy of self-deception. Every triumph he claims turns hollow once you question the motives behind it. And that's what Ridley Scott accomplishes with rare precision. He gives you a hero and quietly unravels him from within. When this first chapter ends, you're left with a man convinced of his righteousness, an audience uncertain of everything they've just witnessed. It's a masterstroke of narrative structure, the perfect setup for the storm of contradictions that's about to follow. When the story shifts to Jacques Legree's perspective, everything changes, not just in tone but in temperature. The world feels warmer, the light softer, and conversations that once seemed stiff now hum with charm and wit. It's the same France, the same castles, the same feasts, and yet you sense an invisible hand painting over the coldness of Gene's version with an almost seductive ease. Ridley Scott doesn't simply retell the events. He reframes them through a man who believes himself to be the hero of his own story. Through Legree, we see what confidence looks like when it has never been questioned, what intellect becomes when it's unmoored from humility. Watching the second half feels like being drawn into a spell, an illusion of reason, grace, and sophistication that hides something profoundly ugly beneath. Lou Gree's account begins with energy and vitality. He is witty, fluent, well-read, favored by the powerful Count Pierre d'Alençon, and comfortable in every social setting Jean finds suffocating. The contrast is immediate. Where Jean's world is made of duty and restraint, Lou Gree's is built on indulgence and eloquence. He believes himself to be a man of progress in a backward age, someone who sees beyond superstition, who admires intellect over brute strength. And for a while, it's easy to like him. You see why others do. He's attentive in conversation, generous in demeanor, and endlessly self-assured. But the brilliance of this section is how slowly that charm turns sinister. His confidence isn't grounded in self-awareness. It's born from privilege. He lives in society that rewards audacity and punishes humility, and he has learned to navigate it with expert manipulation. Every word he speaks sounds true because he believes it, and because no one around him dares to contradict him in his version of events. Jean is a hot-headed, boorish knight incapable of subtlety or gratitude. The same disputes over land and recognition are reframed as Jean's own misunderstandings, his inability to adapt to the politics of court life. Lou Gree presents himself as the loyal friend, the peacemaker, the rational one. He even portrays his growing closeness to Marguerite as something noble, an intellectual bond rather than desire. You begin to see the genius of the Rashomon-style storytelling here. The truth isn't just about what happened, but about how people justify what they do. Lou Gree's narrative reveals how easily self-deception can wear the mask of sincerity. His recollections are filled with literary flourishes, poems, laughter, philosophical conversations about love and virtue. Yet every elegant line hides a crack. Every joke carries a faint echo of entitlement. You realize that Legree doesn't just misremember events. He reconstructs them to protect the myth of his decency. The film's middle section is where the tension becomes unbearable because it forces you into complicity. You're watching a man narrate his crimes as if they were virtues, and the visual support his delusion. The camera frames his interactions with Marguerite in soft light, with music that seems almost romantic. What looked ominous in Jean's version now feels tender, even faded. It's a manipulation so masterful that you understand why such men get away with so much. They turn language itself into a form of armor. Every gesture, every glance is interpreted through Lou Gree's conviction that his intentions are pure. He calls the pursuit of Marguerite love, but it's possession. He sees her intellect as a reflection of his own, her resistance as coyness, her silence as consent. Watching it, I felt physically uncomfortable, because you're witnessing not just an act of violence, but the birth of its justification. The moment he convinces himself that she secretly wanted him, the audience witnesses how power rewrites truth in real time. I remember thinking, during his confession to his confessor, a scene filmed with such delicate tension, that Legree truly believes he has done nothing wrong. He expects forgiveness not because he repents, but because he doesn't think he needs to. That's what makes this section devastating. The tragedy of Legree isn't that he lies to others, it's that he lies so convincingly to himself. His faith in his own moral superiority is absolute. Even when he faces accusations, his shock feels genuine. He cannot fathom that his idea of love could be perceived as assault. Ridley Scott and Adam Driver capture this contradiction with terrifying realism. You see the intellect of a man who has read about virtue, debated ethics, and quoted philosophy, and yet is utterly blind to empathy. It's not ignorance. It's entitlement polished into eloquence. This second perspective also transforms the surrounding world. Count Pierre's court, which seemed rigid and formal before, now feels alive with laughter, flirtation, and indulgence. The banquets are filled with gold light. The dialogue sparkles with irony, but the beauty is deceptive. Beneath it lies a moral rot of society that finds cruelty entertaining as long as it's spoken elegantly. Lou Gree thrives in this ecosystem. He's rewarded for charm, protected by status, and adored for confidence. When he speaks of love, people smile. When Marguerite speaks of pain, they doubt her. That imbalance is the film's quiet cruelty, how easily intelligence can become a tool for domination. By the time we reach the pivotal encounter between Legree and Marguerite, the narrative has hypnotized us into his delusion. The scene, as told by him, is framed as a romantic chase, a moment of mutual attraction fulfilled. He recalls it with passion, sincerity, and even tenderness. But the audience, now aware of the structure of the film, can feel the horror creeping in. The music may swell, but the eyes tell another story. It's one of the most difficult sequences to watch precisely because it's told from the perspective of a man who feels vindicated by his own self-deception. In that moment, the movie achieves something chilling. It doesn't just show an assault. It shows how society enables men to rename it as love. Afterward, Legree acts bewildered at Marguerite's accusation. He believes himself to be the injured party, the one whose reputation has been tarnished unfairly. The arrogance of that reaction encapsulates the sickness at the heart of his world. He can quote scripture, charm nobles, and argue philosophy, but he cannot imagine a reality where a woman's truth outweighs his narrative. His entire identity depends on being believed. So when his story is challenged, he doesn't seek forgiveness. He seeks victory. That's why the duel becomes inevitable once again. It's not about truth. It's about reclaiming dominance. As the second act closes, we're left in a state of moral dissonance. You just witnessed the same sequence of events twice, and neither feels complete. Jean's version was rigid and self-righteous. Legree's is seductive but delusional. The truth lies somewhere between or perhaps outside. Both. That's what makes this structure so powerful. It forces the audience to confront how easily conviction can mask cruelty. Watching Legree, I thought of every story, ancient and modern, where men mistake admiration for consent, where power disguises itself as affection. By the end of his account, you realize the tragedy isn't confined to history. It's ongoing. The film's brilliance lies in that realization that the duel of perspectives never truly ends, only shifts its battlefield from swords to words. When the final retelling begins, the tone changes completely. It's as if the film takes a deep breath and clears away centuries of noise before allowing Marguerite's truth to speak. Gone are the courtly indulgences, the prideful monologues, and the masculine rituals of honor. What remains is a quiet pulse of reality, unembellished, unglamorous, and painfully human. The light changes too. The golden haze of Jacques Legree's world fades into cool, natural tones. The camera no longer flatters or justifies. It simply observes. This is a story as it happened, without filters or fantasies. And from the first moment of Marguerite's perspective, you realize how distorted everything before it was. The same gestures that once seemed noble now appear controlling. The same conversations that felt witty now reek of entitlement. And the same marriage that looked loyal now feels suffocating. Marguerite's version begins with the rhythms of domestic life. Small details, small kindnesses, small cruelties. The film makes you feel the difference between being present and being seen. She tends to the estate, manages servants, keeps accounts, and maintains dignity in a household that doesn't value her mind. Through her eyes, Jean de Courrèges is no longer the humble hero of his own imagination. He is harsh, short-tempered, and obsessed with recognition. His love is possessive, not tender. When he praises her, it feels like ownership. When he prays, it's not for salvation but for victory. The irony is brutal. In his telling, Jean fights for justice, but in hers, he fights for ego. She's surrounded by men who make decisions about her as if she's a ledger entry, dowry, alliance, inheritance, property. The film captures this suffocating environment with startling precision. Even inside her own home, she exists as an afterthought, a vessel for her husband's ambitions. The brilliance of Marguerite's narrative lies in how quietly it dismantles the illusions of the first two. You realize that both Jean and Jacques, enemies in every sense, share the same blindness. They see her not as a person, but as an extension of their self-image. For Jean, she represents legitimacy. For Jacques, she represents desire. For neither does she exist as a full human being. The film doesn't make her a saint or a martyr. It makes her real. She laughs, doubts, hesitates, and fears. She wants to live, to love, to be respected. Her affection for Jean in the beginning feels sincere. She admires his bravery, his persistence. But that affection fades under the weight of his insecurity. There's a devastating scene where she tries to talk to him about the financial mismanagement of their land, and he dismisses her gently, not cruelly, but with that casual arrogance of a man certain he knows best. That one exchange tells you everything about the world she inhabits, a place where intelligence in a woman is tolerated only until it challenges male control. When the rape finally occurs in her account, the movie doesn't flinch, exaggerate, or aestheticize. It's stripped of the romantic sheen that coated Lou Greaves' version. There is no music, no soft lighting, no ambiguity, just a woman fighting for her life in her own home. The power of this sequence lies in its stillness. You hear the sound of her breath, the resistance in her body, the terror that fills the silence when it's over. It's unbearable because it's real. And yet, what follows is even more harrowing. The disbelief. She confides in a friend, and the friend warns her not to speak. Her mother-in-law scolds her for endangering the family name. Even Jean, when told, reacts not with compassion but outrage. Not at what happened to her, but at what it means for his reputation. The truth is reduced to a legal inconvenience. The system treats her pain as a rumor that must be managed, debated, and ultimately proven to the blood of men. Through Marguerite's eyes, the duel itself becomes the cruelest irony. Two men will fight to the death, not to vindicate her truth, but to decide whether she lied. If Jean wins, she is proven honest. If he loses, she will be burned alive. The horror of that logic takes the breath out of you. She stands trial in a court where priests debate whether a woman can conceive through rape, where scholars quote scripture to invalidate her experience. The church, the law, and society unite not to seek justice, but to preserve hierarchy. Ridley Scott turns these scenes into something almost surreal. Rows of men debating her fate, while she stands motionless, hands clasped, aware that no one is actually listening. And yet she doesn't back down. That's the miracle of her character. She chooses to speak even when silence would save her. By this point, the duel, which once seemed like the story's climax, begins to feel like a distraction. The real courage lies in her refusal to let her truth be buried. But the film doesn't make her defiance easy or triumphant. You see her exhaustion, her fear, her awareness that justice is almost impossible in her world. She's not fearless. She's human. That humanity gives her strength. Jodie Comer's performance is extraordinary here. She doesn't play Marguerite as a symbol of virtue, but as a woman forced into the role of history's proof. Every expression, every pause carries weight. You can feel her anger suppressed under layers of etiquette, her intelligence dulled by expectation, her spirit bending but never breaking. And then the duel arrives again, but now you watch it differently. What was one spectacle becomes tragedy. Every blow, every splash of mud, every gasp feels like an act of desperation. You realize how absurd the idea of divine judgment is. No God is intervening here. Just two men killing each other over pride, while a woman's life hangs in the balance. When Jean finally kills Legree, the crowd erupts in cheers and Marguerite's face barely moves. There's no joy, no closure. She's alive, yes, but only because one man happened to stab another. The world hasn't changed. The silence resumes. The priests bless the victor, and history moves on as if nothing happened. Yet the film lingers on her face, the only truth that matters, watching, breathing, enduring. The aftermath is haunting. Jean is celebrated as a hero, their child is born, and life goes on. But you can tell that something fundamental has shifted in her. She's not the same woman who married a night out of duty. She's someone who has looked into the heart of her society and seen its emptiness. The final images of her walking through sunlight with her child are both tender and bitter. They suggest freedom, but also the cost of it. The duel may have ended, but the struggle for truth continues quietly in every generation. This last perspective is where the film transcends history and becomes universal. It isn't just a medieval story. It's an anatomy of how truth is handled by those who hold power. The brilliance of The Last Duel lies in its structure. By the time you reach Marguerite's version, you realize that what began as a story of men has become a story of humanity. Every version of the past is filtered through someone's ego, but hers cuts to that fog-like light through stained glass, pure, painful, and undeniable. The first two men fought for reputation. She fought for reality. And that's why her truth, though fragile, is the only one that endures. When I think about this part of the film, I think of how history so often mistakes silence for peace. Marguerite's story reminds us that silence is just another form of violence, one we've inherited, one we still carry. By the time the credits roll, You realize that this isn't the story of a duel at all. It's the story of a voice finally being heard, even if only for a moment, and how that moment can echo through centuries. Character analysis in this film feels like peeling away layers of illusion until you're left with three souls stripped bare: Jean de Carouge's, Jacques Legris, and Marguerite. Each one is both victim and perpetrator in their own way, each one trapped inside a different form of delusion. What's extraordinary about how Ridley Scott construct them is that they don't simply represent opposing sides of a conflict. They represent entire worldviews colliding. Watching The Last Duel is like watching the anatomy of medieval society, dissected through three human beings who can't escape the lies they live by. And as each of their versions unfolds, you begin to see that truth isn't just contested. It's personalized, warped, and defended like territory. Jean de Carouge's, played by Matt Damon, is the embodiment of wounded pride. Everything about him, his posture, his clipped speech, his clenched jaw, tells you he's a man who has been losing ground all his life and doesn't understand why. You sense at once he might have been noble in the purest sense, brave, loyal, disciplined, but that nobility has been corroded by a system that rewards charm over conviction and politics over courage. Jean is the kind of man who believes the world should be fair simply because he works hard, and when it isn't, he turns bitterness into virtue. His tragedy is that he confuses respect with love, obedience with loyalty, and punishment with justice. He wants to be a hero, but he doesn't realize that heroism requires empathy, not control. When Marguerite tells him she's been assaulted, his first reaction isn't compassion. It's outrage that another man touched what he considers his property. That moment defines him more clearly than any battle. Jean's sense of justice is built entirely around himself. And yet, Damon plays him with such weary sincerity that you can't hate him. You pity him, because you know he's a product of the world that made him a man who thinks he's defending righteousness when he's really defending his ego. Jacques Legris, portrayed by Adam Driver, is a different kind of tragedy. He's what happens when intellect and charm go untested by conscience. If Jean represents rigid pride, Legris represents seductive self-deception. He's handsome, eloquent, and almost intoxicating to watch. He speaks like a man who believes words can make anything true. And that's exactly what destroys him. Driver plays him not as a monster, but as a man who can rationalize monstrosity. His version of love is parasitic. It consumes and then rewrites the act as passion. What makes him frightening isn't his violence. It's his conviction that he's incapable of it. There's a particular scene where he confesses a supposed love from Marguerite to Count Pierre, and Pierre laughs, calling it what it is, a fantasy. But Legris can't hear it. His intellect protects him from doubt. His charm shields him from guilt. And his friendship with powerful men makes him believe he's untouchable. In another time, another culture, he'd be the charismatic genius who excuses cruelty as complexity. In this story, his intelligence becomes his curse. He doesn't understand that seeing oneself as enlightened doesn't make one moral. Driver performance captures that perfectly. The small smirks, the measured tones, the eyes that never look directly at guilt because they're too busy admiring their own reflection. And then there's Marguerite, brought to life with devastating restraint by Jodie. She is the gravitational center of the film, even though the men keep pretending she isn't. Her power lies not in defiance, but in endurance. From the moment the camera sees through her eyes, you realize she has been present in every earlier scene too, just ignored. Comer's portrayal is quiet, but unyielding. She doesn't need speeches or theatrics. Her silence speaks louder than any duel. What makes Marguerite extraordinary is that she dares to exist truthfully in a world that demands performance. She's intelligent, articulate, and kind, but those qualities are treated as provocations. When she manages her household efficiently, the men mock her ambition. When she speaks honestly, they call her ungrateful. Yet when she accuses Legris, she shows a level of courage none of them possess. She risks her life to say something that everyone already knows but refuses to acknowledge. It's one of the film's greatest ironies that the only character who acts out of moral clarity is the one society calls immoral. Marguerite's strength doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from patience. She endures the pettiness of her husband, the arrogance of her rapist, and the judgment of her peers with a grace that feels almost superhuman. But she isn't saintly. She's angry. The film lets you see that anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. When Jean insists on the duel, you can see in her eyes that she knows it's not about justice at all. It's about spectacle. She understands that men are not fighting for her, but over her. That awareness transforms her from a historical figure into a mirror for the audience. Watching her, you feel the weight of every woman in history who was told to keep quiet for the sake of honor. Comer makes you feel that exhaustion, that isolation, but also that quiet rebellion, the choice to speak anyway. Around these three orbit a gallery of secondary characters who flesh out the moral decay of the time. Count Pierre, played with gleeful cruelty by Ben Affleck, is both comic and terrifying. He's the aristocrat who finds everything amusing because nothing threatens him. His scenes are filled with an indulgent decadence that turns laughter into menace. He protects Legris not out of friendship, but because he represents the status quo. Every society has its Pierres, those who find comfort in corruption because it keeps them entertained. Then there's Jean's mother, cold and severe, who embodies the older generation's complicity. She tells Marguerite to endure, to remain silent, because that's what survival looks like for women in her world. Her words are cruel, but her cruelty is learned, inherited, perfected through centuries of submission. Even the priesthood, meant to represent moral authority, becomes a machine of control, debating theology instead of humanity. Together, these characters form a tapestry of delusion. No one in this film is entirely evil, but everyone is trapped in the same lie. That truth can be proven through status, that God takes sides, that silence equals virtue. The duel itself is just a physical manifestation of that illusion. Two men trying to make meaning out of chaos by killing each other, convinced that divine justice will descend with the sword's final strike. But Ridley Scott doesn't let us escape into myth. He holds the camera steady, showing the exhaustion, the blood, the mud. You realize that what they call honor is nothing more than violence dressed in ritual. And that's why the characters linger long after the film ends. They aren't just figures from medieval France. They're archetypes of our own time. The proud man who mistakes grievance for justice, the charming manipulator who disguises cruelty as love, and the woman whose truth must fight to exist at all. By the end, all three characters are unmasked. Jean dies believing he's been righteous. Legris dies still certain he was wronged. And Marguerite survives knowing that justice, as defined by men, was never meant for her. But in that survival lies a quiet revolution. She may have lost everything, privacy, safety, peace, but she gained something greater, authorship. Her story is no longer filtered through the voices of men. And that, perhaps, is the truest victory the film offers. It's not the duel that matters. It's the fact that, finally, someone is listening. Some films hide their strangest facts in plain sight, and The Last Duel does it with almost mischievous precision. Beneath its solemn tone and medieval grandeur lies a mosaic of curiosities, contradictions, and creative decisions that make it far more eccentric than it first appears. Every time I revisit it, I find new layers, not just within the story, but behind the way it was made, written, and performed. It's one of those films where every production choice feels deliberate, every historical detail reconstructed with the care of a scholar, but also the boldness of a storyteller. My literature-loving friends, if the movie itself is a duel about truth, then these little-known facts are like the echoes of that duel, revealing how even reality is subjective when filtered through art. One of the strangest truths is how personal this project was for its creators. Matt Damon and Ben Affleck hadn't written a screenplay together since Good Will Hunting in 1997. More than 2 decades later, they reunited, not to write another story of friendship or redemption, but to explore toxic masculinity and institutional misogyny. What's remarkable is how they structured the collaboration. Damon co-wrote the portions from Jean de Carouge's perspective. Affleck focused on Count Pierre and the feudal elite, and the third writer, Nicole Holofcener, was brought in specifically to shape Marguerite's voice. That division of labor mirrors the film's structure. 3 conflicting versions of the same events, each filtered through a different consciousness. It wasn't just a narrative device. It was embedded in the writing process. Holofcener's contribution changed everything. She insisted that Marguerite's segment not be romanticized, not even visually. Her section had to strip the story of male myth-making, and you can feel that integrity in every frame of her chapter. The authenticity of Marguerite's voice is no accident. its authorship proclaimed inside the screenplay itself. Another peculiar detail lies in the production's choice of locations. Although set in medieval France, the film was shot largely in Ireland, in counties Meath and Tipperary, and some scenes in France and Burgundy. The filmmakers chose Ireland because its overcast skies and ancient stone fortresses resembled 14th century Normandy more faithfully than modern-day France. But there's irony in that, a French story of national legend reconstructed on Irish soil. It's almost poetic, a tale about distorted truth told in a place once colonized by those who rewrote history to suit their power. Even the colors of the landscape, damp grays, mossy greens, ochres of wet earth, mirror the film's moral palette. No pure white, no absolute black, only gradations of decay. Then there's the duel itself, which was reconstructed from meticulous historical records. The real combat between Jean de Carouges and Jacques Legris took place on December 29th, 1386, and was one of the last officially sanctioned judicial duels in France. Chroniclers described it as so brutal that King Charles VI himself had to intervene to allow Carouges to fight. The outcome was recorded almost exactly as shown in the film. Carouges killed Legris, and Marguerite was spared execution. But what's eerie is that no one at the time questioned the system itself. People genuinely believed God guided the victor's sword. Ridley Scott stages it with bone-crushing realism. Yet the absurdity of the belief system makes the scene almost surreal. The actors trained for months in historically accurate armor, each weighing more than 30 kilograms. Damon and Driver insisted on performing much of the combat themselves to capture the exhaustion of fighting in steel. By the time the scene was done, both had bruises that lasted for weeks. What we see on screen isn't stylized choreography. It's near punishment disguised as cinema. One of the most haunting behind-the-scenes facts involves Jodie Comer's preparation. She read not only the historical trial documents, but also medieval theology on women's morality, particularly treatises that claimed women could not conceive unless they felt pleasure. Those very words appear in the courtroom scenes. Comer wanted Marguerite's performance to carry the weight of centuries of that pseudoscience, to show that she wasn't just fighting her assailant, but an entire intellectual tradition that erased women's credibility. There's an eerie precision in her performance. The way her breathing changes during interrogation scenes, the tremor that appears only when men aren't looking. She built her portrayal around quiet rebellion. No dramatics, just unwavering presence. Scott reportedly told her, "Play the truth as if no one will believe it." And she did exactly that. Another strange intersection between history and cinema lies in the costume design. The armor and gowns were crafted to look authentically heavy, not glamorous. Each costume was designed with practical limitations, buttons, clasps, and seams that would have existed in 1380s France. The result was that actors moved less freely, their gestures slower, their expressions more deliberate. That physical constraint bled into their performances. Damon's stiffness, Driver's feline grace, Comer's contained movements, all emerged from how the costumes literally restricted them. Costume became character. Even the duel's mud was a calculated mixture of clay and organic soil to maintain its consistency under studio lighting, which means every splash we see was engineered chaos. The film also hides small visual motifs that echo its themes. In Jean's version, sunlight filters through armor. In Jacques, it reflects off silk. In Marguerite's, it passes through windows, never fully reaching her. That's not accidental. The cinematographer, Dariusz Wolski, designed each version's lighting to represent who controls the narrative. In men's stories, the light flatters them. In hers, it exposes. If you look closely, the camera lens shifts slightly between tellings. Jean's scenes use more static, symmetrical compositions. Jacques' are shot with smoother camera motion, and Marguerite's employ handheld realism. It's subtle enough to feel subconscious, but it transforms how we perceive truth. Even motion itself becomes biased. And then there's Affleck's Count Pierre, a bizarre, almost satirical character that some critics found too modern. But what many don't know is that Affleck bases mannerisms on documented behaviors of actual medieval aristocrats who were known for hosting erotic poetry readings and public debates about virtue while committing every sin imaginable. The blonde hair, golden robes, and lazy grin weren't exaggerations. They were references to descriptions of nobles written by chroniclers of the time. His laughter during Legree's confession wasn't improvised. It was taken directly from a recorded dialogue where Pierre mocks a knight for calling his assault a crime of passion. That grotesque authenticity turns Affleck's performance from parody into indictment. One particularly strange historical footnote is how Legree was, in his own time, celebrated as a brilliant scholar and administrator. After his death, a local legend even arose claiming his ghost haunted the site of the duel, protesting his innocence. For centuries, some historians actually debated whether Marguerite's accusation was true. It wasn't until the 20th century, with the rediscovery of trial documents, that scholars recognized how carefully she had testified, how consistent her details were, and how systematically the court had tried to discredit her. So, in a haunting way, the film's three-part narrative isn't just a storytelling choice. It mirrors how history itself misremembered her. Another little-known fact: Ridley Scott completed this film in House of Gucci in the same year, both about power, pride, and public judgment. He directed The Last Duel immediately after Napoleon preparations began, which is why many of the same crew worked on both projects. There's an almost eerie rhythm to that coincidence, an aging director obsessed with how men rewrite history for glory, creating 3 films about arrogance and downfall back-to-back. Perhaps the strangest truth of all, though, is that The Last Duel was released in 2021, the same year the world was still reckoning with its own real-life accounts of assault, power abuse, and disbelief. The film flopped at the box office, earning far less than it cost, dismissed as too grim or too historical. And yet, it might be one of the most relevant stories of its decade. Audiences didn't want to face it. History, it seems, repeated itself. But over time, it's begun to find quiet reverence among viewers who recognize how rare it is for a historical epic to tell the truth about power, not the fantasy of it. That, to me, is the strangest fact of all, that a film about truth could be ignored precisely because it told it too honestly. There's something mesmerizing about the way The Last Duel positions itself within film history, not just as a narrative, but as a mirror reflecting the moral exhaustion of both the past and the present. When I first started reading the critical responses that followed its release, I was struck by how divided they were. Some critics called it a forgotten masterpiece. Others dismissed it as another Ridley Scott period epic burdened by self-importance. But what fascinates me is how these conflicting opinions actually echo the structure of the film itself. Just as the story is told through 3 irreconcilable versions of truth, the movie's reception became another duel, this time between critics, audiences, and history. And that's why this section feels so important. Because the movie isn't just about medieval scandal. It's about how societies, both then and now, process truth through narrative, through spectacle, and through convenience. One of the most compelling critical perspectives came from those who recognized how bold the film's structure really is. By splitting the story into 3 retellings, Scott and his writers resurrect the Rashomon device, a technique made famous by Akira Kurosawa in 1950, but they weaponize it differently. Kurosawa's version asked whether truth is subjective. The Last Duel insists that truth exists but is deliberately obscured by power. The difference might seem subtle, but it's profound. The film isn't saying everyone has their own truth. It's saying men rewrite the truth until it serves them. That distinction is what many early reviewers missed, perhaps because they expected another gladiatorial drama rather than a philosophical autopsy of patriarchy. The irony is that the same male-dominated industry that the film critiques was the one reviewing it. And just like the medieval judges who dismissed Marguerite's testimony, many critics praised its performances while missing its thesis. Some reviewers compare it to Gladiator 2000, calling it a spiritual cousin because both deal with violence, honor, and spectacle. But that comparison almost diminishes it. Gladiator is about vengeance and redemption. The Last Duel is about futility. It still doesn't resolve anything. It only exposes the absurdity of seeking divine justice through blood. This difference becomes clear when you study how critics from different cultural backgrounds approached it. American reviewers often focus on its pacing, calling it slow or bleak, while European critics admired its realism and moral restraint. French historians even praised its fidelity to documented accounts of the Carouge's case, noting that it captures the era's psychological and theological contradictions better than any modern adaptation. There's a haunting irony here. A movie about a French legend made by an English director, starring American actors, ended up being appreciated most in the country whose history it dramatized. The film's feminist readings offer another layer of complexity. Some scholars place it alongside works like Promising Young Woman, or, she said, modern stories about belief and justice. But what separates The Last Duel is that it doesn't project modern sensibilities onto its period setting. Instead, it traps us inside the ignorance of that era and lets us feel the claustrophobia of it. The courtroom scenes, where male judges debate whether women can feel pleasure in rape, are so outrageous they'd be comical if they weren't true. Critics who praise the film's authenticity pointed out that Ridley Scott resisted the temptation to modernize dialogue or simplify morality. He trusted discomfort to do the teaching. Jodie Comer's Marguerite doesn't make speeches. She simply exists with unbearable honesty. And in that honesty, we recognize the modern world's reflection. Different costumes, same systems. One of the most interesting cultural analyses I've read argued that The Last Duel should be understood as a film about storytelling itself. In that sense, it's not just about gender or justice. It's about authorship. Who has the right to tell a story? Who decides what counts as truth? These questions extend beyond medieval France and reach into modern cinema, media, and politics. Each man in the film tells a story that justifies his role, his identity, his importance. Jean turns his life into a morality play about righteousness. Jacques rewrites his crime into a romance. Even the church and the king turn Marguerite's suffering into entertainment for their courts. That's not so different from how contemporary audiences consume stories of trauma, filtered, dramatized, and packaged for attention. Critics who recognize this layer called it one of Ridley Scott's most self-aware films, a work that exposes the hypocrisy of the spectacle it participates in. Every sword, every prayer, every tear is both sincere and staged. And yet, despite this moral sophistication, the film was misread by many as a box office flop. It earned only a fraction of its $100 million budget during its theatrical run, partly because it premiered in the pandemic's shadow and partly because audiences didn't know how to categorize it. Was it a historical drama, a feminist parable, or a medieval thriller? The marketing failed to communicate its depth, and modern viewers, accustomed to instant moral clarity, found its ambiguity frustrating. But years later, the film has begun to find its audience online, in essays, discussions, and university screenings. Critics who once ignored it now revisit it with reverence, calling it one of Scott's most introspective works. The duel itself, they note, has become a metaphor for film's life. Misunderstood at first, vindicated later, when time finally caught up with its message. Another fascinating angle comes from film historians who connect The Last Duel to Ridley Scott's long obsession with the failure of systems. From Blade Runner to Kingdom of Heaven to Alien, Scott has always explored how institutions, corporations, religions, armies, devour the individuals who serve them. Here, the institution is patriarchy itself. It's not just background, it's the villain. The critics who recognize that saw how Scott, now in his 80s, wasn't revisiting medieval history for nostalgia, but for confession. The film feels like an apology to every story history got wrong. That's why it doesn't end with triumph, but with Marguerite's silence, one that says more than any sermon could. Philosophically, the movie also invites comparison to existential literature. In Jean-Paul Sartre's terms, the duel represents bad faith, man's attempt to anchor morality in external validation rather than internal conscience. Courreges believed that by killing Legree, he proves righteousness. But what he really proves is fear, the fear confronting his own limitations. Likewise, Legree represents Nietzsche's shadow, a man who mistakes self-belief for truth. Marguerite, by contrast, embodies Kierkegaard's leap of faith, the courage to speak truth when all reason suggests silence. Critics from the literary world caught this undercurrent more sharply than film critics did. For them, The Last Duel isn't historical fiction. It's philosophical tragedy. And then there's the audience reception, which adds another duel of interpretations. Many male viewers describe the film as grueling, uncomfortable, or one-sided. Many female viewers called it cathartic, even necessary. That divide, too, mirrors a movie's theme. The discomfort is the point. It's supposed to make you question why you sympathize with certain characters earlier and not others. When I think about that, I realize how brilliant its construction is. It doesn't just show how stories are told. It forces you to participate in the act of misjudgment, to feel the bias within yourself. Ultimately, the critical conversation around The Last Duel says as much about us as it does about the film. In an age where stories are constantly reframed to fit ideological narratives, Scott gave us a movie that refuses neat alignment. It's not an anthem or a manifesto. It's a mirror, and maybe that's why it unsettled so many people. It reminds us that truth isn't just hard to find. It's harder to sit with once you do. Years from now, I think it will be seen the way Blade Runner once was. Misunderstood on release, later recognized as prophecy. Because in its quiet way, The Last Duel isn't just about medieval justice. It's about the eternal trial of truth itself, still being fought in every courtroom, newsroom, and screen we watch today. Every production carries its own story, and with The Last Duel, the making of the movie feels almost as epic and as conflicted as the film itself. Behind its stoic armor and medieval brutality lies a process driven by creative risk, logistical complexity, and moral precision. It wasn't just another historical reconstruction for Ridley Scott. It was a passion project designed to dissect centuries-old social machinery while preserving cinematic realism. What emerged was a production that, in many ways, mirrored its subject, a massive, collaborative duel of vision, ego, and endurance. My literature-loving friends, as we move through behind-the-camera world, you'll see how even filmmaking can become a battlefield of truth and perception. Ridley Scott began work on The Last Duel in late 2018, shortly after finishing All the Money in the World. He was already in his 80s, yet his energy seemed untouched by time. Known for his near-military efficiency on set, he's famous for operating multiple cameras simultaneously, shooting fast, and rarely needing second takes. But here, he took a different approach. Because the film depended so heavily on performance nuances, on how tiny gestures shifted meaning between versions, Scott slowed his process down. He studied not just medieval architecture or costume, but human psychology. He asked his actors to perform scenes multiple times with subtle tonal changes, once with sincerity, once with manipulation, and once with ambiguity. Each retelling had to feel complete on its own, yet inconsistent enough to fracture under scrutiny. Damon later said that the hardest part wasn't memorizing lines, but learning to act the difference between what a character believes happened and what actually did. The collaboration between Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, and Nicole Holofcener shaped the film's moral DNA. Damon and Affleck were eager to return to screenwriting, but they were aware of their limitations. We're two men trying to tell a story about the dangers of male privilege, Affleck admitted in interviews. So they brought in Holofcener, whose writing had long dissected gender and class dynamics with sharp empathy. The trio's process was unconventional. They divided the script by perspective. Damon wrote Jean de Carouge's section, rigid, honorable, severe. Affleck wrote Jacques Legree's and Count Pierre's world, decadent, witty, careless. Holofcener crafted Marguerite's narrative, patient, intelligent, quietly furious. Scott described the finished script as a triptych painting, each panel painted by a different artist. That blend of styles is what gives the film its unusual rhythm. You can feel where the pens change hands. Damon's dialogue clipped and soldierly, Affleck's golden and ironic, Holofcener's intimate and painfully real. Shooting began in early 2020, right before the pandemic shut down global production. The film was midway through principal photography in France and Ireland when restrictions forced everything to halt. For months, the cast was scattered, the set sealed, and the armor packed away. When filming resumed, it was under intense safety protocols, with reduced crew and restructured schedules. In a strange way, that interruption deepened the movie's mood. The world outside was wrestling with its own questions of survival, truth, and human fragility, exactly the same themes the film explores. Scott, famously unsentimental, pushed the team forward. History doesn't stop, he said in an interview. Neither do we. His persistence gave the movie an almost prophetic quality, a story about the silence of women made during a time when the world itself was silenced. The casting process was another battlefield of vision. Matt Damon initially resisted the idea of playing Jean de Carouge's. He worried audiences wouldn't sympathize with a character so self-righteous and emotionally inaccessible. But Scott insisted. "You've always played the good man," he told Damon. "Now play the man who thinks he's good." Adam Driver, by contrast, accepted Legree almost instantly. He has that uncanny ability to humanize arrogance, to make evil look reasonable. He studied medieval philosophy and Latin court documents to understand how Legree might justify himself. His line deliveries, calm, articulate, confident, came from his background as a former Marine, channeling a controlled intensity that mirrors a soldier's moral compartmentalization. Jodie Comer was the last major addition. Scott had seen her in Killing Eve and said she possessed eyes that could both accuse and forgive in the same breath. She spent months reading historical testimonies and learning archaic dialects to ground her performance. On set, she reportedly carried a small notebook filled with Marguerite's private thoughts, never shown to anyone else, never spoken aloud, so she'd carry her interior world even when silent. The visual design of the film is a triumph of restraint. Cinematographer Dariusz Wolski, who has collaborated with Scott since Prometheus, refused to romanticize the period. The medieval world here isn't painted in fantasy hues. It's damp, grimy, and lived in. The armor reflects muted daylight rather than gleaming heroism. The interiors are lit by candlelight that barely penetrates the shadows. Wolski described the look as truth through texture. Each of the three perspectives has a distinct visual temperature. Carugez's world feels gray and claustrophobic. Legree's glows golden with privilege. Marguerite's breathes in soft, natural light. The color palette wasn't just aesthetic. It was psychological. It visualized who believed they controlled the story. The sound design and score add another layer of realism. Composer Harry Gregson Williams avoided grand orchestral sweeps typical of historical epics. Instead, he built the soundtrack around percussive tension, heartbeat rhythms, ritualistic drums, and subtle choral textures that sound both sacred and suffocating. The duel soundscape in particular was mixed using authentic recordings of steel-on-steel combat, layered with the ambient breathing of the actors to emphasize fatigue. The result is immersive but not glamorous. The sound of metal grinding against bone isn't stylized, it's human. Even the smallest production choices carried weight. Scott instructed costume designer Janny Yates to design Marguerite's dresses with visible wear, to avoid the visual lie of medieval perfection. She used plant-based dyes and hand-stitched fabrics, so that each costume looked like something lived in, not paraded. For Damon and Driver, armor was fitted to restrict movement deliberately, forcing authenticity into their gait and posture. When Damon walks, you can almost feel the weight crushing his shoulders, a physical manifestation of Jean's inner rigidity. Behind the scenes, Affleck's portrayal of Count Pierre created moments of dark humor. On set, he reportedly slipped into character so fully that even between takes, he teased castmates with the same smirking flamboyance. Scott encouraged it, saying Pierre's casual cruelty had to feel effortless. Crew members described the filming of Pierre's scenes as a party when executioners smile. That atmosphere seeps into the final cut, opulence tainted by decay. Editing the film was another duel entirely. Scott and editor Claire Simpson had to weave 3 overlapping timelines without confusing the viewer. They used rhythm rather than chronology to guide perception. Key moments like a kiss, a look, or phrase reappear across versions, sometimes identical, sometimes fractionally different. The editing relies on audience memory, forcing viewers to notice how the smallest change in tone transforms meaning. Simpson said she approached it like cutting a fugue, each repetition deepening the melody instead of duplicating it. One of the strangest production facts is that the duel itself took weeks to film and left the actors mentally drained. Damon called it a physical dialogue, saying that every strike and counterstrike was a continuation of the character's argument. The crew described it as controlled chaos, real mud, real exhaustion, and a director who insisted on natural weather. The rain you see in that scene isn't artificial. They waited days for clouds to break the same way history recorded them. Scott's obsession with precision bordered on ritual. He even consulted fencing historians to choreograph movements consistent with 14th century judicial combat manuals. In the end, production wrapped in October 2020. The film went through post-production during global lockdowns, with the crew editing remotely across continents. When it premiered in 2021, It carried the weight of years of meticulous labor compressed into a story about centuries of injustice. Watching it, you feel not just the artistry but the endurance behind every frame, the patience, the discipline, the quiet defiance of truth-tellers surrounded by noise. That's what makes a production story so hauntingly poetic. The Last Duel wasn't just about the courage to speak. It was made by people who live that courage in the face of impossible odds. The setting of The Last Duel feels like another character, unyielding, watchful, and soaked in centuries of moral rot. Ridley Scott doesn't simply use medieval France as a backdrop. He transforms into a living organism, one that breathes cold air and whispers through stone walls. From the first shot, you can sense the geometry of society built on power, faith, and fear. My literature-loving friends, when you look beyond the armor and castles, what you see is a landscape of contradictions, a world built to inspire, all yet designed to control. It's an architecture of obedience, where beauty exists only to mask brutality. The film's geography feels oppressive. The castles are not majestic. They are fortresses of isolation. Every tower and courtyard seems built to contain people rather than protect them. The rooms are narrow, lit by the sickly glow of tallow candles, with ceilings that press down like judgment. Scott and cinematographer Dariusz Wolski shot much of the film in authentic medieval locations, like Cahir Castle in Ireland and fortified estates in Burgundy, where stone walls still carry the scars of siege. You can feel the chill, the moisture, the echo of steps that vanish into corridors. It's a world without warmth. When Jean de Carouges returns from war, his home feels less like victory and more like confinement. The domestic spaces are just as severe as the battlefield, reminding us that patriarchy doesn't stop at the gates. It starts inside them. Every location in the movie reflects a moral hierarchy. Jean's lands are barren and gray, stripped of comfort or decoration, a reflection of his rigid worldview. His home is practical, almost monastic, echoing with unspoken resentment. Lou Grie's environment, by contrast, glows with indulgence. Count Pierre's palace is drenched in gold light, full of tapestries and laughter, a playground for the privileged. It's the visual equivalent of hypocrisy, a place where ethics drown in wine. When Marguerite appears in those settings, she looks out of place, her composure like a thread of sanity running through madness. The contrast between the two worlds, the cold austerity of Carouges and the soft corruption of Legris, tells the story of class without a single word of exposition. What makes the setting remarkable is its realism. Scott refused to romanticize the medieval world. The fields are muddy, the armor dents easily, and the air seems perpetually damp. There's a tactile heaviness to everything. Horses snort steam, soldiers stumble through muck, servants trudge with exhaustion. It's as if the entire landscape conspires to remind us that survival itself is a daily battle. And yet, within that grime, Scott finds poetry. A shaft of light cutting through a barn door, a reflection of firelight on wet stone, a snowfall drifting over corpses. All of it feels painterly. The world is both cruel and exquisite. It's easy to imagine that Scott, a painter before he was a director, composed each frame as a living canvas of contradiction, beauty born from decay. Light plays a crucial role in shaping this universe. In Jean's version, light is harsh and directional, almost punitive, falling like judgment from a narrow window slit. It exposes flaws, hardens features, and strips color from faces. In Lou Grie's world, the light is diffuse and golden, flattering, making sin look seductive. And in Marguerite's story, the light is natural, soft daylight, often filtered through fabric or fog, neither forgiving nor cruel. That progression of illumination isn't just aesthetic, it's philosophical. It charts the movement from illusion to truth, from performance to authenticity. Even the sun seems to take sides, shining brightest when lies are told and dimming when honesty finally arrives. The film's use of weather amplifies its emotional texture. Rain is omnipresent, not just a motif, but a kind of divine indifference. Battles unfold under gray skies, weddings under overcast light, confessions under shadows. The duel itself takes place in winter, with frost on the ground and steam rising from the fighters' breaths. The world seems to hold its breath too, waiting for justice that never truly comes. The elements are indifferent witnesses. They cleanse nothing, they merely observe. That's one of the quiet devastations of the movie. The natural world remains pure while human civilization festers. It's as though the earth itself knows that honor, religion, and law are all man-made illusions. Architecture reinforces this fatalism. Cathedrals rise like stone sermons, cold and monumental. The film's church interiors are designed not for worship, but for intimidation. When Marguerite walks into a chapel to pray, she looks smaller than the pillars around her, engulfed by sanctity that offers no refuge. The contrast between spiritual promise and human cruelty couldn't be sharper. The church claims to mediate divine truth, yet becomes another courtroom, another weapon. In these scenes, faith feels like another form of imprisonment, an ornate cage that justifies injustice. Scott's framing always emphasizes this irony. People kneel in prayer beneath crosses while plotting betrayal or punishment. Even nature in the film seems to echo the character's psychology. The forests where men hunt and fight are dense and colorless, filled with damp fog that obscures distance. Perfect metaphors for moral blindness. The land itself feels weary, as if it's been soaked in too much blood and pride. When Marguerite tends her garden, it's one of the few times the frame breathes. The color green reappears only in those moments of domestic life, suggesting that truth and tenderness can survive only in small, hidden corners, far from the spectacle of men's wars. It's subtle, but it carries emotional weight. In a story ruled by steel and stone, Marguerite's garden is rebellion, a reminder that creation still exists amidst destruction. The soundscape of these settings adds another dimension. There are long stretches with no music, only ambient sounds. Wind against wood, armor creaking, distant church bells, dogs barking, a baby cry behind a door. The silence feels heavy, like an unspoken verdict. When music does appear, it's sparse and ritualistic. Drums that sound like heartbeats or processions, chants that hover between reverence and dread. The world isn't scored like a Hollywood epic. It's scored like a confession. What's particularly striking is how the settings evolve with perspective. In Jean's eyes, the world is unjust but orderly, a place where honor can be reclaimed through struggle. In Legree's, it's vibrant, permissive, and full of opportunity, a playground for those who know how to charm it. In Marguerite's, it's suffocating and cruel, but also real, tangible, and worth saving. The camera treats her spaces with empathy. It lingers on textures, linen, bread, wool, sunlight on dust, as if grounding her in the physical world denied to men who live in abstractions. The contrast between their imagined grandeur and her daily realism exposes everything wrong with their system. They talk about honor. She has to live with its consequences. By the time the duel begins, the setting itself has transformed from spectacle to judgment. The muddy arena, filled with cheering nobles and the clanging of metal, feels like an apocalyptic theater. The banners flutter like tattered remnants of faith, and the sky above looks bruised. You realize that every wall, every field, every drop of rain has been leading to this, an entire civilization circling itself, mistaking ritual for righteousness. The duel doesn't just happen in this world. It happens because of it. And when it's over, when the ground runs red and the crowd erupts, the stone walls remain unmoved. The setting, like history itself, keeps its silence. That silence is the film's most haunting element. The world of The Last Duel doesn't apologize, doesn't change, doesn't even blink. It just endures, beautiful, indifferent, eternal. And maybe that's Ridley Scott's final commentary, that architecture, landscape, and light outlast the delusions of men. The world remembers everything. It's only people who forget. Behind the camera of The Last Duel, there's a kind of secret theater, a network of human determination, craft, and accidents that gave shape to the movie's soul. What fascinates me most about this part of the story, my literature-loving friends, is how the behind-the-scenes process mirrors the very duel it portrays. Every department, writing, cinematography, editing, costume, direction, became a participant in its own battle for authenticity, truth, and endurance. Ridley Scott, by this point one of cinema's great veterans, directed the entire production like a general at war. He didn't simply reconstruct a medieval world. He rebuilt an ecosystem of control, faith, and deception to the act of filmmaking itself. You can sense that intensity in every frame, because this wasn't just another period drama. It was a creative campaign fought on multiple fronts. Scott's reputation for discipline is legendary. He storyboards obsessively, uses up to 6 cameras at once, and often shoots entire scenes in a single day that would take other directors a week. But for The Last Duel, he broke his own habits. The story demanded subtlety, different tones, emotions, and meanings from identical sequences. He had to shoot the same scenes 3 times, each one through a different lens perspective. Jean's rigidity, Jacques' delusion, Marguerite's clarity. The cast called it the triple mirror. Jodie Comer described it as like living 3 different lives in the same body. Each retelling required minute changes, hand gestures, eye contact, the distance between 2 people, so that the truth remained visible only when all 3 were seen together. Scott rehearsed every variation meticulously. He didn't allow improvisation in these sequences. The timing of each pause and breath was choreographed. Even a half-second delay in dialogue could distort the psychological rhythm. What we see on screen feels spontaneous, but behind it lies a structure as exacting as medieval theology. The production design team, led by Arthemax, faced one of the toughest challenges of Scott's career, building medieval France during a global pandemic. Locations had to evoke authenticity without digital manipulation. They scouted abandoned fortresses, repurposed old stone churches, and rebuilt parts of Normandy's Carouge's estate in Ireland. Every material, wood grain, brick pattern, iron hinge, was designed from surviving blueprints of 14th century architecture. Max even consulted archaeological reports to ensure the texture of castle walls matched the climate of the era. Those details, invisible to casual viewers, give the film its haunting realism. You can almost feel the centuries pressing down on every frame. During shooting, rain would pour unexpectedly across Ireland's skies, and instead of waiting for clear weather, Scott embraced it. The Middle Ages were wet, he joked, so let them stay wet. What could have been an inconvenience became one of the film's most authentic atmospheric signatures. The actors, too, fought their own battles with history. Matt Damon endured weeks of physical training to move convincingly in armor, weighing nearly 70 pounds. He practiced horseback combat daily, learning to maneuver while blinded by a visor that narrowed vision to a slit. Adam Driver's challenges were psychological. He had to play Legree not as a villain, but as a man who doesn't recognize himself as one. That required rehearsing scenes where he had to project sincerity while performing moral blindness. Driver once said that the hardest scene wasn't the duel or the assault, but a confession to Count Pierre, because that's where the audience might almost believe him. Comer, by contrast, worked in quiet intensity. She built Marguerite's performance from silence outward. She asked Scott to minimize dialogue where possible, letting her face carry the narrative. She also requested closed sets for sensitive scenes, ensuring emotional control. It said that during her final take of the testimony sequence, the entire crew stopped moving, unwilling to break the spell of her composure. That stillness carried directly into film. The costume and armor departments became laboratories of history. Designer Janie Yates supervised hundreds of hand-stitched garments, using natural dyes and techniques that predated industrial tailoring. The fabrics were deliberately heavy and restrictive. Even wealthy characters appeared burdened by their clothes. Damon's armor was modeled after French military carvings from 1380, each plate jointed for functional mobility. Adam Driver's, by contrast, was sleeker and polished, a metaphor for vanity disguised as elegance. Comer's costumes told her story subtly. In Jean's chapter, her dresses are structured and confining. In Jacques, they're slightly more luminous. In her own, they become simpler, more tactile. Yates later revealed that the team used no synthetic materials whatsoever. Every fabric was linen, wool, or silk. It gave the cast literal weight to carry, grounding their performances in physical discomfort. When you watch them move, you're watching history pressing against flesh. The duel sequence itself is one of the most grueling ever filmed in a Ridley Scott production. It took nearly 3 weeks to shoot, with cameras running continuously through rain, sleet, and mud. The actors performed most of their stunts without doubles. Scott demanded that they fight in full armor for realism, which meant enduring extreme fatigue. The temperature during shooting dropped close to freezing, and the mud was so thick that crew members had to pull cameras free with ropes between takes. But the result is astonishing. No frame feels staged. When Damon gasps for air or Driver stumbles in exhaustion, it isn't acting. It's survival captured on film. One of the stunt coordinators described the duel as a ballet of exhaustion, saying every thrust was choreographed not for spectacle but for degradation. Scott wanted the violence to feel ugly, not heroic, a direct rejection of cinematic myth-making. Even post-production was a battlefield. Editor Claire Simpson had to weave 3 films into one seamless narrative. The risk was confusion. Repetition could dull the story if handled poorly. So Simpson used sound cues and camera rhythms to distinguish each retelling. Jean's scenes cut sharply, mirroring his bluntness. Jacques flows smoothly, as if seduced by his own confidence. Marguerite's unfold with natural pacing, almost documentary-like. Scott and Simpson communicated daily through remote sessions due to COVID-19, trading notes on tone and tempo. They treated the structure like a piece of music. Each perspective is a separate movement that culminates in a final crescendo, the duel itself. The sound design team worked similarly, layering subtle auditory differences. Legree's scenes hum with background chatter and indulgent laughter. Marguerite's are marked by distant silence, the kind that makes truth echo louder. One fascinating behind-the-scenes story involves Ben Affleck's Count Pierre. On set, Affleck's flamboyant portrayal worried some producers, who feared it would break the film's serious tone. But Scott defended him fiercely. "He's the world that makes monsters possible," he said. "He should feel absurd." Affleck improvised many of Pierre's offhand jokes and gestures, using his golden robes and bleached hair as symbols of detachment from morality. It's a rare example of a director encouraging satire within tragedy. And it works. Pierre's world becomes a moral background noise of privilege that allows men like Legree to thrive. The crew's dedication often bordered on devotion. During a storm that nearly shut down filming, Scott refused to stop. "The clouds are doing God's lighting," he quipped, grabbing his monitor to reposition shots. The team adapted around him. Cinematographers used natural light so skillfully that even technical mishaps turned poetic. At one point, a horse slipped in the mud during the duel, and Scott kept the take. "That's truth," he said. That philosophy guided every creative decision. Embrace imperfection, because that's where truth hides. When production wrapped, there was a palpable sense of reverence among the cast. They weren't just leaving a film, they were leaving a world. Damon said the final day felt like closing the gates of a fortress. The editing continued through lockdowns, with Scott working across 3 time zones. When he finally watched a complete cut, he reportedly said, "That's the truest film I've made." It's fitting that a story about truth required such relentless honesty behind the camera. Every bruise, every sleepless night, every real breath of steam from an exhausted actor became part of that honesty. And that's why the behind-the-scenes story feels inseparable from the movie's spirit. The filmmakers didn't just recreate history. They relived it, fought it, and bled with it. Every person involved was, in their own way, part of the duel, struggling against time, fatigue, and the weight of centuries. The final film carries that battle within it. You don't just watch The Last Duel. You feel the ghost of its making. Hands sewing, swords clashing, breath fogging, truth fighting for space between camera lenses and conscience. And maybe that's what makes Ridley Scott's craftsmanship timeless. He doesn't film history as something past. He films it as something still happening. Themes and symbolism in The Last Duel emerge gradually, almost stealthily, as if Ridley Scott wants us to experience the movie before realizing what it's truly about. At first glance, it looks like a story of vengeance, chivalry, and faith, classic ingredients of a medieval epic. But as the layers peel away, it becomes clear that what we're watching isn't about honor or war at all. It's about the machinery of power that defines who gets to tell the truth. My literature-loving friends, if we look closely, this is not a movie about the duel. It's about the conditions that made the duel necessary. It's a portrait of patriarchy disguised as piety, and its symbols are everywhere. The sword, the church, the courtroom, and even silence itself. The film's central theme is truth versus perception. Each of the 3 perspectives, Jean's, Jacques, and Marguerite's, reflects how human beings distort reality to preserve self-image. Jean sees truth as divine reward. If he fights bravely and wins, God must be on his side. Jacques sees truth as desire. Whatever he feels intensely must be justified. Marguerite sees truth as lived reality, something beyond manipulation, yet constantly under attack. What's brilliant is that Ridley Scott doesn't allow any of these truths to exist independently. They depend on one another, each feeding the illusion of certainty. The movie's structure itself becomes a metaphor for how truth survives, not as a single shining answer, but as fragments survive in the fire of interpretation. The duel, often mistaken as a climax, is actually a ritualized lie, the physical manifestation of a society incapable of reason. It's the moment when power replaces logic, when faith becomes a weapon. The duel doesn't determine who's right. It determines who's left. It's a symbol of mankind's desperate need for order, even when that order is meaningless. Watching the duel, you realize that the spectacle isn't justice, it's theater. The crowd cheers as though witnessing divine intervention, but in reality, they're watching random survival elevated to revelation. The film's title, The Last Duel, becomes symbolic too. It isn't only the last judicial combat in France. It's the last gasp of an age trying to justify oppression through religion and ritual. Another powerful theme is ownership, the way people, especially women, are treated as property in the medieval world. Marguerite's story exposes how deeply this idea runs. Her husband believes he owns her loyalty, her body, even her truth. Her rapist believes he owns her consent through charm. The court believes it owns her life. Every institution treats her existence as collateral in a transaction between men. The duel itself is about ownership disguised as virtue. Jean doesn't fight to defend her. He fights to reclaim his reputation, his lineage, his right to possess honor. Marguerite's voice threatens the entire system not because it's false, but because it's free. That's why her truth feels revolutionary. It breaks the economy of ownership on which their world runs. Silence, too, functions as both symbol and theme. Throughout the film, silence is equated with safety. Jean's mother advises Marguerite to endure and keep quiet, claiming survival is better than truth. The church's silence legitimizes sin. The king's silence transforms cruelty into policy. Yet it's Marguerite's refusal to stay silent that gives the film its moral heartbeat. When she speaks, she doesn't just accuse one man. She accuses civilization. That's why the courtroom scene is so suffocating. It's not a woman seeking justice. It's a voice confronting history itself. Silence is both weapon and shield. It's how power hides and how victims survive. When she finally breaks it, the world trembles. Faith is another essential thread. The movie portrays religion not as spirituality, but as structure. Churches loom like stone judges, and priests act more like lawyers and shepherds. They use scripture to rationalize violence and submission, transforming divine will into bureaucracy. The concept of God's judgment becomes a terrifying irony. The belief that truth can be proven by blood. The duel's outcome is said to represent divine justice, but all it really proves is humanity's arrogance. In that sense, the Last Duel becomes an indictment of blind faith. Scott doesn't attack religion itself. He attacks its misuse, the way it sanctifies hierarchy and condemns empathy. When Jean prays before battle, you can feel that his God is a mirror reflecting his ego. Marguerite's quiet faith, on the other hand, feels intimate and sincere. She doesn't pray for victory, only for survival. Her belief isn't divine reward, but in human conscience. Another recurring symbol is the landscape. The endless mud, gray skies, and bare trees reflect a world drained of vitality. Nature in the film acts as truth itself, silent, incorruptible, and indifferent. It witnesses everything without judgment. When rain falls during battle, it washes no one clean. It simply continues. The earth absorbs sin without complaint, a reminder that morality is human fiction. The contrast between the purity of the natural world and the decay of human civilization deepens the film's fatalism. The duel's muddy pit, where armor and bodies sink into earth, becomes a metaphor for humanity's moral quagmire. No one escapes clean. The film also uses light as a moral compass. Each perspective's illumination tells us something about its storyteller. Jean's scenes are overcast, harshly lit, symbolizing rigidity and judgment. Lou Greaves glow with golden radiance, suggesting vanity and illusion. Marguerite's use soft, realistic light, sun through linen curtains, daylight on her skin, signifying truth unadorned. When she testifies, the court's torches flicker like unstable morality. During the duel, light shifts dramatically. The sun breaks through clouds just as Jean kills Legree. The crowd interprets it as divine confirmation, but the audience recognizes a cruel irony. It's simply weather. Nature doesn't take sides. The light isn't God's approval. It's Scott's final mockery of human superstition. Power is the spine of every theme in The Last Duel. From social hierarchy to gender politics, every act revolves around maintaining control. The king's laughter during the trial symbolizes how detached the ruling class is from morality. To them, truth is a form of entertainment. Count Pierre's decadence shows how corruption becomes self-sustaining. He shields Legree not out of friendship, but because Legree's mirrors his own. The film suggests that institutions don't exist to uphold justice. They exist to preserve themselves. The duel, the court, the church, the crown, they all function like concentric circles of authority, protecting the core illusion. That power equals righteousness. Marguerite's pregnancy adds another symbolic layer. Her unborn child becomes the embodiment of uncertain future. Innocence carried within a world that punishes honesty. The possibility that she could die for speaking truth while carrying life turns a duel into an allegory for continuity. Truth, like birth, demands pain. In one haunting moment, she tells Jean that if he loses, she and the baby will burn. Her calm acceptance of that fate transforms her into something more than a historical figure. She becomes an eternal witness, the mother of truth that refuses to die. There's also a broader philosophical layer running through the movie. The idea that humanity repeats its delusions endlessly. The duel may be the last, but its logic survives. Societies still find ways to disguise ego as justice and dominance as morality. That's why the film feels so unsettlingly modern. Its medieval trappings only make its reflection sharper. The system of men deciding the value of a woman's word hasn't vanished. It has evolved. That's what gives the story its haunting relevance. What happened to Marguerite de Carouges in 1386 still happens, in subtler forms, every day. If there's one unifying symbol, it's the act of storytelling itself. Each retelling isn't just a perspective, it's a performance. The men narrate themselves into heroes, while Marguerite tells a story no one wanted to hear. The final title card, The Truth, according to Marguerite de Carouges, is Ridley Scott's quiet rebellion. He doesn't say the truth as fact. He says, according to, acknowledging that even the most honest voice is framed within history's bias. But in giving her the final word, he rewrites centuries of silence. That's the movie's greatest symbol, narrative as justice. By the time the film ends, its themes converge into one overwhelming realization, that truth in any age must fight for survival. The duel was never about guilt or innocence. It was about whether truth could live in a world ruled by pride. And as Marguerite walks away in the final scene, sunlight on her face, you feel that the symbol has changed. She isn't walking into freedom, but into endurance. Her survival isn't victory, it's testimony. The Last Duel isn't about the death of chivalry. It's about the birth of accountability. And that makes it one of the most quietly revolutionary stories ever told. When you strip The Last Duel down to its bones, what you find underneath is a masterclass in filmmaking technique, a convergence of visual philosophy, sound design, editing rhythm, and tonal precision that elevates its story from historical retelling to cinematic revelation. Ridley Scott has always been a craftsman obsessed with precision. But here, that precision becomes a kind of language in itself. My literature-loving friends, the artistry of this movie lies not in spectacle, but in restraint. Every frame is an argument, every cut a confession, every sound a ghost is something unspoken. This is filmmaking as anatomy, the slicing open of form to reveal the truth inside function. Let's begin with Scott's visual grammar. His collaboration with cinematographer Dariusz Wolski creates a distinct visual architecture for each perspective, one that subtly manipulates how we experience morality. Jean de Carouges' world is filmed with harsh, static compositions, wide frames, low contrast, and heavy gray-blue tones. The camera barely moves, reflecting his rigidity and moral stubbornness. Every shot feels like a portrait of someone trapped in his own righteousness. Jacques Legree's version, in contrast, breathes with mobility. The camera glides, tracks, and dances around him, often following his gestures as if seduced by his charm. The light is golden, soft, diffused through warm filters. Even his crimes are framed beautifully, a deliberate contradiction that forces us to confront how aesthetics can disguise violence. Marguerite's perspective strips all that away. The color palette shifts toward realism, sunlight, candlelight, and pale interiors without filters. The camera often lingers on her face in still, natural light, letting emotion exist without artifice. That visual honesty becomes the film's ethical stance. Truth isn't cinematic, it's plain, quiet, and unglamorous. Editing plays an equally crucial role in shaping perception. Claire Simpson structures a film like a recursive poem, repetition without redundancy. Scenes reappear but never feel identical, because rhythm changes meaning. For instance, when Marguerite first greets Legree, Jean's version cuts quickly, emphasizing suspicion. Legree's version extends a moment, adds eye contact, softens the lighting, and slows the pace, transforming unease into flirtation. Then, in Marguerite's telling, the same scene is shorter, stiffer, and painfully awkward. The dialogue doesn't change, but the pacing does, revealing how timing is moral. The editors even played with microseconds of reaction time. Who looks away first, who breathes slower, to alter power dynamics. It's almost imperceptible, but emotionally devastating. Scott uses these repetitions not as gimmicks, but as moral instruction. He teaches you to distrust what you see, then makes you feel complicit in that distrust. Sound design functions as the invisible architecture beneath everything. Harry Gregson Williams' score avoids melody in favor of texture. Low cellos, muted percussion, dissonant choral fragments that sound more like prayers half remembered than songs. The score doesn't guide emotion, it unsettles it. During Legree's romantic scenes, faint strings rise like whispers of delusion. In Marguerite's testimony, the music vanishes entirely, leaving the weight of silence. That absence becomes louder than any symphony. The duel itself, perhaps the film's technical apex, is an auditory masterpiece. The clanging of steel, the thud of armor against mud, the breathing of the fighters, it's mixed to feel suffocating, like you're inside the helmets with them. There's no triumphant score, no crescendo of heroism, only the raw physics of pain. Sound becomes morality. Truth becomes a thing you hear once all lies fall silent. Lighting, one of the subtlest storytelling tools here, operates like a moral metaphor. The three perspectives move from artificial illumination to natural light. Jean's world is mostly firelight and overcast skies, a controlled environment representing discipline. Legree's world glows with golden excess, candles, chandeliers, stained glass. Marguerite's is illuminated by daylight, the only light not created by man. That transition carries symbolic weight. The film literally moves from constructed light to truth's illumination. Even the duel follows this arc. It begins under dark clouds and ends under piercing sunlight. Many critics misread that as divine intervention, but the filmmakers intentionally treated it as coincidence. Nature, indifferent and timeless, simply witnesses human folly. Scott's lighting strategy visualizes one of the film's deepest messages, that truth exists outside human drama, waiting patiently to be seen. The camera work in battle sequences reveals another layer of Scott's technique. The early war's Jean fights are filmed with long lenses, compressing space and blurring distinction. Men reduced to chaos. You can't tell who's who, which mirrors the dehumanizing nature of war. In the duel, the camera goes handheld and visceral. Every tilt, shake, and focus shift feels like a heartbeat. It's not action choreography. It's psychological anatomy. The audience doesn't observe the fight. It experiences a claustrophobia of desperation. That realism comes from Scott's insistence on shooting with natural weather and real physical strain. The duel's final moments, mud splattering on the lens, the camera trembling as the crowd roars, blur the line between viewer and participant. Cinema becomes confession again, no longer spectacle, but suffering. Another hallmark of Scott's direction is his painter's eye. Before he was a filmmaker, he was an art student trained in composition and chiaroscuro. You can see that heritage in every frame. The movie's visual compositions echo Renaissance paintings, diagonal lines guiding the eye toward moral centers, bodies arranged in tableaus that reveal hierarchy. When Marguerite testifies, she's centered beneath a crucifix, her face half-lit, surrounded by darkness. It's Caravaggio by way of confession. When Jean rides through war-torn landscapes, he's framed against horizons like a figure from Jericho's Wrath of the Medusa, heroic but doomed. Even small domestic moments, Marguerite combing her hair, light filtering through linen, carry echoes of Vermeer's realism. Scott doesn't use beauty to soften brutality. He uses it to remind us that beauty and horror often coexist. Cinematographically, the film rejects the glossiness of most historical dramas. There are no sweeping drone shots or romantic sunsets. Instead, Wolski employs long shadows, diffuse skies, and overexposed highlights that make the world feel uncomfortably real. The camera often observes from slightly above eye level, as if judgment itself is watching. Even the use of lenses contributes to symbolism. Jean's sections use longer focal lengths, flattening space, and emphasizing confinement. Legree's employ wider lenses with shallow focus, giving him room to move, to seduce the frame. Marguerite's combine both styles, clear foreground with deep backgrounds, acknowledging both oppression and perspective. It's visual storytelling at its most disciplined, the kind that doesn't need dialogue to speak. The film's rhythm, its editing tempo, reflects moral progression. Jean's section feels heavy, almost sluggish, mirroring his worldview. Lou Greaves flows like a courtly waltz, seducing the viewer into complicity. Marguerite's is measured, intimate, and precise, truth-paced like breathing. The final duel breaks that structure entirely. The cuts accelerate, sound fractures, the visual clarity collapses. When Jean finally kills Legree, the editing slows again, not as catharsis, but as exhaustion. Justice feels heavy, not triumphant. That rhythm, orchestrated through careful cross-cutting, is one of the most overlooked triumphs of the film. Then there's color, the hidden language of the movie. The palette moves from muted blues to corrupt golds to pale grays. Paralleling the emotional arc, blue symbolizes duty and rigidity. Gold symbolizes vanity. Gray represents truth stripped of embellishment. The duel unites all three, muddy earth tones swallowing every hue, turning ideals into soil. The movie literally ends in neutrality, color drained, justice unresolved. Even the closing sunlight on Marguerite's face is pale, almost colorless. It isn't warmth, it's clarity. The world hasn't changed color. It has simply shown its real one. And finally, the box office story itself becomes part of the filmmaking narrative. The movie's failure to attract mainstream audiences is poetic irony. Like its heroine, The Last Duel spoke truth to a world distracted by noise. Scott himself said, "Maybe people don't want to hear it yet." That comment completes the circle of technique and meaning. A film that exposes the dangers of selective truth was, in turn, selectively ignored. But the craft endures. Every technical decision, light, sound, camera, edit, works toward a single moral idea: that truth cannot be stylized. It must be endured. When you rewatch The Last Duel, you start to feel that its filmmaking isn't just illustrating history, it's performing it. The camera becomes judge, the editor becomes confessor, the composer becomes conscience. All these techniques fuse into something hauntingly rare. A film that uses the tools of cinema not to entertain, but to testify. The real duel, you realize, wasn't fought with swords at all. It was fought with lenses, light, and silence. And Ridley Scott, in his 80s, still fights that battle better than anyone. When The Last Duel finally reached audiences, its cast became an inseparable part of the conversation. The performances, interviews, and public reactions formed a second story around the film, one that reflected its themes in real life. Watching how the world responded to the actors, my literature-loving friends, feels like watching the duel continue off-screen. Each performer carried their character far beyond the set, and the world's divided reactions to them revealed how deeply this movie touched cultural nerves about truth, gender, and accountability. Matt Damon, who plays Jean de Carrouges, approached the role as a deliberate break from his usual heroism. In press discussions, he described Jean as a man born into a code that's already dying. His weathered face, scarred from years of battle, wasn't makeup alone. It was designed to evoke the erosion of conviction. Damon spoke about how uncomfortable it was to play a man whose pride eclipses empathy. He said he built Jean's moral rigidity from the inside out, learning to make every gesture slightly defensive, as though armor existed beneath his skin, even when he wasn't wearing any. Critics praised the honesty of his performance. Jean could have been a caricature of medieval arrogance, but Damon infused him with tragic sincerity. Some reviewers compared his portrayal to Michael Horton's King Lear, a man too stubborn to see that his own virtues are poison. Viewers found him both pitiful and infuriating, which is exactly what Scott wanted. Not a hero, but a mirror. Adam Driver's Jacques Legree became one of the most talked about performances of 2021. Driver's background in theater and his ability to play intelligence without warmth made him perfect for a role that depends on charm. He said in interviews that he approached Legree as someone who doesn't think he's lying. He studied the psychological language of entitlement. The pauses, the smile that over-explains, the gaze that turns confession into persuasion. His performance divided audiences. Some saw him as tragically self-deluded, others as pure predator. That division was intentional. Driver wanted viewers to recognize how easily charisma can mask cruelty. His quiet confidence in the courtroom scenes, the way he adjusts his sleeves, the small smirk when questioned, became chilling emblems of institutional arrogance. Critics compared his composure to Anthony Perkins in Psycho, charm as camouflage. Yet what makes his performance unsettling is how human it remains. He doesn't play evil, he plays the absence of empathy, which is far scarier. Jodie Comer's portrayal of Marguerite de Carrouges became the film's moral and emotional spine. Her performance isn't loud, it's architectural, built with silence, restraint, and tiny shifts in expression that carry the weight of centuries. Comer said she treated Marguerite not as victim or saint, but as a woman surviving history. She immersed herself in medieval literature, reading account of women's trials to understand how limited their vocabulary for pain had been. On set, she kept a diary written in Marguerite's voice, filling it with unsent prayers and unsaid words. That private record, she explained, helped her preserve the character's interior life even in scenes where she said nothing. When the film premiered in Venice, critics called her performance a quiet revolution. Variety described her courtroom testimony as one of the most dignified depictions of truth in modern cinema. The way she trembles without breaking, the way her eyes meet the judges with exhausted clarity, it feels less like acting and more like endurance. She doesn't play emotion, she survives it. Ben Affleck's turn as Count Pierre shocked many viewers. With his bleached hair, eyeliner, and insolent laugh, he seemed to step out of a different movie until you realize that his grotesque flamboyance is the point. Affleck defended the choice in interviews. He's a man who finds his own corruption amusing. That's how systems rot. His improvised quips and smug charm inject dark comedy into scenes otherwise suffocating with tension. Critics initially called the performance too modern, but over time, appreciation grew. The absurdity of Pierre's decadence became the film's commentary on elite detachment, the ruling class as spectators of suffering. Affleck's chemistry with Driver also adds a twisted mentor-disciple energy, highlighting how power perpetuates itself through laughter and complicity. The ensemble beyond the leads deserves recognition too. Harriet Walter, as Jean's mother, embodies generational complicity, a woman hardened by survival, teaching silence as wisdom. Her single warning to Marguerite, "You must endure," lingers like an ancestral curse. Martin Chokus as Pierre's steward, Alex Lauder as the boy King Charles VI, and the array of priests and courtiers create a world so believable that it feels documented rather than dramatized. Lauder's performance, in particular, captures the terrifying indifference of monarchy, a boy amused by death, watching the duel as if it were theater. The film's premiere at the Venice Film Festival drew standing ovations, especially for Comer, but the broader public reaction was conflicted. Some viewers admired its seriousness. Others found it grim and slow. Yet almost every discussion circled back to her performance. Women in the audience described feeling seen in ways that historical cinema rarely allows. Men debated whether the movie was fair to its male characters, an irony the film itself anticipates. Comer's presence shifted the balance of the conversation from spectacle to empathy. In interviews, she expressed gratitude for working with Damon and Driver, but noted the emotional toll of retelling trauma through 3 male perspectives. "It reminded me how many times women's experiences are rewritten until they sound convenient," she said softly. That sentence encapsulates the film's entire thesis. After release, Damon and Affleck appeared together in numerous interviews reflecting on their return to screenwriting. They admitted they'd been humbled by the experience of handing the third act to a woman. "Nicole Holofcener taught us what it means to shut up and listen," Damon said. That collaboration became a talking point in media coverage, the symbolic reverse of the movie's hierarchy, where male storytellers yielded authorship to female truth. It's a rare moment when making a film so precisely mirrors its message. Audience reactions evolved with time. On streaming platforms, the film found new appreciation. Viewers who skipped it in theaters began praising its performances and integrity. Social media threads dissected Comer's micro-expressions, Driver's manipulative tone, Damon's moral blindness. The duel scene went viral not for its violence, but for Comer's expression afterward, the absence of triumph, the hollow survival. People recognized it as the most honest ending possible. Critics revisiting the film a year later called it the performance showcase of the decade. Comer received BAFTA and Critics' Choice nominations, though, controversially, not an Oscar nod. Many saw that omission as a reflection of the very dynamic the film condemns, the undervaluing of women's voices in stories centered on men. What stands out ultimately is how the actors' off-screen attitudes reinforce their on-screen meanings. Damon represented humility learned through error. Driver embodied intellect questioning morality. Comer represented courage refined through grace. Affleck, with his theatrical arrogance, symbolized the decadence of those who laugh from balconies. Together, they didn't just act, they reenacted the argument of civilization. Who is believed, who is forgiven, who is remembered. When the credits roll, the performances linger not because of dialogue or expression, but because of balance. Each actor occupies their corner of the moral triangle. Jean's righteousness, Legree's delusion, Marguerite's truth, and none cancels the other. It's a perfect ensemble equilibrium, where performance becomes philosophy. In interviews afterward, Scott summed it up best. They're not playing heroes or villains, they're playing history. And that might be the highest praise any cast can earn. For a film about truth, the truest thing it ever achieved was the sincerity of the people who brought it to life. The conclusion of The Last Duel feels less like the end of the story and more like the quiet after a confession. When the final images fade, the duel won, the crowd roaring, Marguerite standing motionless, you realize Ridley Scott hasn't made a film about victory at all. He's made a film about exhaustion. My literature-loving friends, that exhaustion, moral, spiritual, historical, is what lingers long after the credits. The duel may be finished, but the argument never ends. The movie closes not with closure, but with a haunting echo, one that asks us, after all the centuries of retelling, have we really learned to listen? The last sequence, where Marguerite walks through the sunlight with her child, is deliberately restrained. There's no triumphant music, no swelling emotional cue. The light isn't radiant. It's pale, almost sterile, like truth itself. The audience breathes for the first time, but it isn't relief, it's unease. Jean is dead, Legree is gone, yet the system that created him remains untouched. The world keeps turning. The church will continue to judge, the nobles will continue to laugh, and women will continue to navigate the ruins of men's egos. That realization, subtle yet devastating, turns the ending into a paradox. Marguerite lives, but justice doesn't. The duel might have been God's judgment, but the only divine presence of film is her endurance. Ridley Scott resists every temptation to romanticize that endurance. He doesn't frame Marguerite as triumphant or saintly. She's simply alive, and that is enough. It's a revolutionary decision for a director, so often drawn to grandeur. In Gladiator and Kingdom of Heaven, victory came a catharsis. In The Last Duel, survival is the only form of grace. When she steps outside into that bright, unblinking light, she represents something the film has been building toward from the first scene, the reclaiming of authorship. For 2 hours, we have seen history told by men who weaponize language. Now, for a few quiet moments, a woman writes with her existence alone. Her silence in that closing shot is not submission. It's ownership. Rewatching the film, I realize how perfectly that structure fits Scott's late career. After decades of creating cinematic monuments to men's ambition, soldiers, emperors, explorers, he ends up making a film that dismantles all of them. The Last Duel feels like the director's reckoning with his own artistic past. The mud, the armor, the violence. It's all familiar territory. But here, those images are stripped of heroism. The sword that once symbolized courage now looks ridiculous, clumsy, heavy. The duel doesn't glorify battle. It exposes its emptiness. It's as if Scott, in his 80s, has turned the camera on his own mythology and said, "We've been worshiping the wrong things." There's also something profoundly literary about how the film concludes. The three-act structure, Jean's pride, Jacques' delusion, Marguerite's truth, echoes classical tragedy, where catharsis comes not from resolution but from recognition. Each character faces a mirror they can't bear to look into. Jean dies believing he has restored honor, never realizing he has merely perpetuated oppression. Lugris dies still certain he's been wronged, a man destroyed by his inability to perceive others as real. Marguerite, the only one who evolves, survives into a world that refuses to change. It's a grim symmetry worthy of Shakespeare or Euripides. The gods are silent, justice is blind, and humanity keeps repeating its errors under different names. The duel's brutality becomes a metaphor for every time in history that power demanded a performance to validate truth. Even the title feels ironic by the end. The Last Duel suggests finality, but the story insists that there's always another duel, between genders, between memory and history, between justice and spectacle. Every age simply changes the weapons. Today, the battlefields are digital, the armor is language, but the fight for credibility remains the same. That's why the film resonates long after the armor is gone. It reminds us that storytelling itself is a duel, and whoever controls the narrative controls belief. Marguerite's endurance doesn't end the fight. It preserves it, ensuring that truth survives long enough to be rediscovered. In interviews after the release, Jodie Comer said something that captures the movie's essence. Marguerite doesn't win, but she refuses to vanish. That line feels like the film's true epitaph. Her survival isn't about conquering a system, it's about haunting it. When the king and the church bless Jean's victory, their rituals already feel obsolete. You sense history shifting quietly, as though a door is open to a future that hasn't arrived yet. The audience, knowing what centuries followed, become complicit in that delay. We are part of the system that keeps truth waiting. And that's what gives the ending its sting. It implicates us. Cinematically, the final minutes are a marvel of tone. The music doesn't swell, it withdraws. The camera lingers in long, unhurried shots, letting light and silence speak where dialogue cannot. The duel's noise fades into the sound of wind, footsteps, a child's small breath. The earth that once drank blood now holds sunlight. It's as though nature has reclaimed the story, offering neither forgiveness nor punishment, only perspective. The entire movie seems to exhale, releasing centuries of repression in a single sigh. In that quiet, you feel the film's deepest truth, that justice in any age is not something granted by systems. It's something remembered by individuals. Years from now, I believe The Last Duel will be remembered as one of Ridley Scott's most important works. Not because of its scale or action, but because of its courage to confront silence. It doesn't lecture or sentimentalize. It simply exposes. It asks us to re-examine every myth we've inherited about heroism, masculinity, and divine authority. And it does so with such moral precision that you can't escape its implications. Watching feels like standing in a cathedral after everyone has left, hearing only echoes of faith turned into stone. When the final text appears, the truth according to Marguerite de Carouges, you realize the genius of that phrasing. It doesn't claim universal truth. It acknowledges perspective. Yet by ending on her version, the film restores the balance history denied. It's a cinematic resurrection of a voice buried for centuries. And as that title fades, you can almost hear the distant rumble of another duel somewhere in time. Different faces, same fight. So, what does The Last Duel leave behind? A challenge. To listen differently. To question the stories that history tells through its victors. To recognize how often silence is mistaken for peace. For me, it stands as a quiet monument, not of bravery, but to endurance. A reminder that survival, when surrounded by lies, is itself an act of rebellion. And to my friends who love cinema for its power to reveal the soul of humanity, if ever a film deserved to be revisited, dissected, and remembered, it is this one. Because long after the swords have rusted and the shouts have faded, The Last Duel keeps whispering the only truth that matters. That justice begins when someone dares to speak. If you found meaning in this reflection, my literature-loving friends, please subscribe, and stay with me for more deep journeys into cinema's hidden heart. Every story we explore here at Cinema Vault is another duel, with time, with art, with ourselves, and together we'll keep listening for the truth that still speaks through the silence.